cancer. This is an interesting lecture because, again, like nervous system, seems like every family has a story, right? They have a loved one. So my mom passed away from cancer. So this one's of particular, interest to me. I showed a lot of mom's imaging on the last lecture because we were dealing a lot with the brain cancer. But ultimately, it was actually lung cancer that took her. It was inoperable, and she went through chemotherapy, but her body was just too weak to actually survive. And chemotherapy is kind of an interesting arrangement, right? Because what we're doing is, so this chemical therapy, and it wasn't until much later in my career that I really started to understand what chemotherapy was. So these are chemicals or drugs that are toxins, and so you deliver them to a patient to try to kill the cancer cells. But most of the chemotherapy, at least classically, is not very specific. And so it kills all cells. And what you're trying to do is have it kill the cancer cells first, and you have enough life in you as you get weaker and weaker and weaker that the cancer dies and you survive. Okay? Of course, the physicians or the oncologists are watching very carefully to make sure that you're strong enough to receive chemotherapy, and that's actually one of the limitations. You have to be diagnosed early enough in your cancer fight that the physician thinks that there's a good chance that you can handle the chemotherapy, because you're basically poisoning your system. Okay? Now, a lot of the chemotherapy drugs are targeting fast replicating cells. And so there's some level of targeting. So they're drugs that kill fast replicating cells primarily. And hair is a fast replicating cell. And so that's why a lot of chemotherapy drugs, if patients are on chemotherapy, they lose their hair. Okay, fast replicating hair. And that's mostly up here. Not all of your body hair is fast replicating. It's terminal hair. Okay? But your head, and some of you, it's like every 5 or 6 weeks you have to get a haircut because it grows pretty quick. Okay? So cancer is just a huge topic, and again, we are literally just going to scratch the surface. But I want to give you enough of a background that maybe it'll provide some insight into your own, personal lives with loved ones, or it may provide some insight into a future direction, because cancer is here to stay. We have definitely not kicked cancer, right? We've actually been pretty creative, and there's a lot of new cancer medications and drugs that are coming out that are far more superior. So there's now more specificity on chemotherapy and targeted chemotherapy. That's what my mom was on. There's immunotherapy now that's targeted immunotherapy, and a lot of this has far fewer side effects than the old classic traditional chemotherapies. And those have just been around in like the last decade. And every year there's new cancer medications that are coming out and new ones that oncologists are reaching for. So literally, if you're diagnosed with cancer, a close friend who's a faculty member here at NAU and who's wrestling with pancreatic cancer, and we have these conversations about the types of chemotherapy that he's trying. And every couple of weeks there's kind of something new that the oncologists bring up as, there's a clinical trial on this, there's this new way of doing that. So this is definitely a huge future field that many of you may decide that you're interested in pursuing. Okay?
Just out of curiosity, how many types of chemotherapy are there?
How many types of chemotherapy? I don't even know the answer to that. Like, probably hundreds. Yeah. Probably hundreds of different variations. And it's usually a cocktail. So what I mean by that is it's usually not one. So if they're giving a patient a chemotherapy regime, it's usually a few different drugs that they customize for that patient. The doctor feels like they want to use a little of this, a little of that, a little of this. And so when you take like all the different traditional chemotherapy agents and the newer ones, and then all the variations of the cocktails that the doc just tries to customize, there's literally hundreds of variations that could be prescribed.
You said like it targets like hair cells and stuff like that. I've had a friend and she had went through chemo and she put like I think it was a cold cap
I don't know, but it may be that she wasn't on a chemotherapy that targeted the fast replicating cells, because there are some that don't. So not all chemotherapies will you lose your hair away. Yeah, only certain ones. So I don't know about the cool cat thing, but. Okay, so let's go over some terminology. Backing up a little bit, right? Before we kind of get into how we treat it. Let's back up a little bit on what is it? Well, it's uncontrolled cell growth. Cancer is not contagious. So if you go visit a friend or a family member in the hospital, and you have to gown up or put a mask on or gloves or all of the above, it's not because they're worried about you getting cancer. And some of you are like, really? But there's, again, some people have a very limited experience or exposure to cancer and don't understand much about it. So I want to make sure that we all are on the same page. It's not something that's contagious. But the reason you're gowning up is if they are being treated with chemotherapy, their immune system is now suppressed. So actually it's to protect the patient from you, because you're walking in there carrying all sorts of bacteria and viruses in with you. We just travel around with all sorts of stuff on us all day long. And so they're actually trying to protect the patient from you, not protect you from the patient, okay? Just to make sure that's why you need to wash your hands, okay? Put a mask on. If you have a cold, they will probably tell you, please don't visit. It's just not worth it, you know? Make a phone call, wait until you feel better. You just don't want to expose that patient who now has a compromised immune system to something that could actually be very dangerous for them. In tumor formation, we've got this term that comes back up, which is a malformation or dysplasia. Dysplasia and the formation of a new growth or a neoplasm. And so these are your cells that mutate and they start growing outside of normal cellular regulations. There's two main types. And so here are some terms that you've probably heard. There are benign cancers and then there are malignant cancers. And the benign cancers are the ones that are like a pre-cancer or it's early cancer. It's not as dangerous. It's often the type that they say, well, we're going to watch it and then maybe make some decisions. They might decide, depending on where it is, to go remove the benign lesion because they're worried that it might become malignant later on. But malignant tumors are the ones that we worry the most about. They're the ones that will break off and metastasize. They will go other places in the body or spread. Okay? So malignant's the bad cancer. Benign is, if there is a way to describe it, is the good kind of cancer. Okay? We've got some terms of dysplasia. Anisocytosis, or cytosis. Anisocytosis is cells of unequal size. So in a dysplasia, you're going to see cells of an equal size. You're going to also see poikilocytosis. And this is cells that are abnormally shaped. And then hyperchromatism. And this is the presence of high number of mitotic figures. That's an indication that the cells are dividing aggressively. So unequal size, right? Anisocytosis. Unequal shape. That's the poikilo. And then hyperchromatism is increased cellular divisions. So these three are characteristics of a dysplasia that I want you to be familiar with. Anisocytosis, cells of equal size. Poikilocytosis, abnormally shaped or unequal shaped cells. And then hyperchromatism. High level of mitotic figures, meaning an increase in cellular divisions. Right? They're starting to divide more aggressively. So if we look at this lesion and we see a tumor, we can characterize it being benign on the left, and we can characterize it being malignant over on the right. And if we look at the comparison and the contrast, so this would be in the uterus, is the figure. The benign characteristics are going to be slow growing, low mitosis. It has a very well-defined border, meaning it's probably spheroid, okay, or oval shaped. So if you surgically wanted to go in and remove it, it would be very easy to cut it out, or relatively easy. The cells are well differentiated. What does that mean? That means that the cells look like the tissue that they come from. So in the uterine wall, they would look like smooth muscle. They're well differentiated. There's no metastasis. There's no evidence of it breaking off. You can kind of see the lesion right here. It's circular. And it's really not called cancer. It might be called a benign lesion, a precancer, okay? It's the good news that you get when you come back from pathology and they say, oh, we don't have to worry, it's not malignant. Now, in contrast, so this example here would be this leiomyoma right here. In contrast, leiomyosarcoma on the opposite side, rapid growth, high mitotic levels, undefined border. You can see how it's branching out. This would be much more difficult to surgically resect. Okay? So you see, you hear the words, well, so-and-so has cancer and it's non-operable. It's a non-operable malignant tumor. That's what my mom had around the primary bronchi of her lung. Right? So it was malignant, not well defined, so it'd be hard to surgically cut it out. You can't remove the primary bronchus. You'd be taking out one of the lungs, essentially. And it had already metastasized, stage 4, it already metastasized to the brain. So we knew that it was in this category and it was not surgically operable, so that's why they went to chemotherapy. Okay? Bless you. It invades local tissue. It's poorly differentiated, meaning it does not look like the tissue that it came from. So if it came in from the uterus, for example, then it's not going to look like smooth muscle anymore. It looks like something completely unorganized. Metastasis is possible, and we call this cancer. You can see the histology comparisons. This looks like smooth muscle on the left where it's benign, and this does not look like smooth muscle. A lot of times there's actually a necrotic center because that lesion is growing so fast that the center of it can't quite support the rapid growth, and so you have a little bit of the necrotic core as it starts growing, and the vascular supply is trying to keep up. Question?
So you said that it's not well differentiated from its surroundings. That's why we cannot usually operate on it. But it looks like because you just said that it's very differentiated from it doesn't look anything like the thing it came from.
So two different things. One is in malignant, it doesn't have a well-defined border. That's why it's not surgically operable. But it's poorly differentiated, meaning that it doesn't look like the surrounding tissue.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
But why can't we tell the difference? Why can't we like define its borders if we can already tell that it looks different from everything around it?
Well, you can define its borders, but its borders do this. It has all these little finger-like projections. It would make it much more difficult to surgically cut it out. You'd have to trace all this. Whereas here, you just make a circle. Does that make sense? You can see the borders. They're not well defined, meaning they're not like, you know, if you come in here and you want to surgically remove a tumor, a lot of times they take the tumor out and they take a little bit of healthy tissue around it. They take a little bit of healthy margin just to be safe. And so here, that's really hard to know where do you cut. You just kind of cut this whole area out. Whereas here, you could actually remove the middle part, leaving a little bit of smooth muscle on either side, and that would probably heal up nicely. Whereas this is actually crossed over the basement membrane, and is actually starting to push out into other tissues. So you don't know how far it's gone. Okay. All right, some more terminology. So neoplasia is a word that means new growth, but it literally translates to. These cells are said to be transformed because they replicate outside of typical or standard cell regulatory signals. So instead of, and there's a picture of a cancerous lesion in the mouth, an oral neoplasia. You ever go to the dentist and they, right when you're done, right? You're all done, they're wrapping everything up. You've told them about your Disneyland, vacation and all of your summer plans or your holiday plans with your mouth open, and you're amazed that they can understand what you're saying, right? So those of you that are dental hygiene, I'm always fascinated about what class that is. Right? So I'm like, oh, that sounds like a fun trip there, Dr. Keller. Like, how did they know what I right? So that must be an amazing class that you're going to take in the future. But at the very end, they take a 4x4, grab your tongue, and they start moving around and looking all over the oral cavity. They're looking for oral cancer. Okay? And cancer cells, typical cells, will go through pauses, gap 1 and gap 2, where you check the integrity of the DNA before you replicate. You guys remember this from basic bio? You're like, painfully yes. Well, the reason that that's important is it comes into play now. It's very important before you copy the DNA that you check the integrity of the copy. Okay? You want to make sure that you have the right nucleotides that are going to be preserved. Because you can have a single point mutation, we'll talk about this later, and that can make all the difference. That can change everything. And so every cell goes through a pause, 2 pauses, where the DNA is checked. And in transformed cells, they replicate faster and they don't pause. And so the rate or the opportunity for mutations is much, much higher. Okay? All right, so we'll get there a little bit later when we talk about some of the mechanisms. Okay, some gory pictures, right? Also not great for the dinner table. Okay, so a lot of the terminology and the nomenclature is starting to shift a little bit in the field, but in its beginning, there was a lot of terminology that was based upon the type of tissue where you found cancer. So, for example, carcinoma, right? The carcinoma is referring to a transformed epithelial line. So up in the upper right, you see a squamous skin carcinoma. That's affecting really the epidermal layer of the skin. That's why it's squamous skin carcinoma. And it's an epithelial type of cancer. Okay, that's the nose picture. Then you have an adenocarcinoma. An adenocarcinoma is the picture below. That's like prostate cancer. Prostate cancer is an adenocarcinoma, prostate adenocarcinoma. This is the epithelial of glandular tissue. And so in this picture, in this H&E sample on the lower left, you can see there's a lot of crowding going on here with cell replication that's taking place outside of the normal glandular tissue that should be present. And so if you look here, here's a normal glandular tissue here. These right here, these sort of clusters of this 5 cluster right here. Here's glandular tissue that's this adenocarcinoma of the prostate that is replicated well beyond the borders of here. Here's another one. Here's another one over here. Here's another one up top. So do you see the differences of these in the periphery versus these right here, right down the center? This is abnormal up here, abnormal, and then abnormal down on the lower right. And right in the center are the normal glandular prostate histology. Okay? So that's an adenocarcinoma. Sarcoma. Sarcoma is transformed connective tissue from the embryonic mesoderm. And I don't have a picture of that one, but we'll get there. Leukemia. A leukemia is a cancer of the blood or the bone marrow, and that's the picture underneath the nose. This is a blood smear looking at a blood type of cancer. And then lymphoma is the bottom right picture that looks like a hand stuck on somebody's leg. That's actually not the calf muscle. This is a hand. This is the forearm. So that lymphoma is cancer in the lymphatic system. This is usually presenting as a solid tumor of the lymphoid cells. And there's lymphatics that track the entire venial network. So you have these lymph nodes all throughout the body. And when you have a lymphoma, a lot of times it's a cancer of those lymphoid tissues that can be found in any one of those lymphatic tissues. This is a picture of a colon polyp. This is a benign glandular tumor, an adenoma. It's projecting into the colon. And you can kind of appreciate the stalk that's attached to the basement epithelium. And so this is normal tissue here. This is normal tissue here. And this colon polyp is the cancerous mass that replicated and never stopped replicating. It should have just kept this little shape right here. And you can see this little turn right here, this little turn right here. This is this colon polyp. And typically they'll come in here, band this off, and then they'll snip it and cauterize using the colonoscopy. They remove those colon polyps. And in families that have history of colon cancer, colonoscopies might start as early as in your mid-40s. Definitely by your 50s, you're getting colonoscopies. Typically, men have their first colonoscopies in their 50s, just to make sure that there aren't any polyps, and so you don't develop a colon type of cancer. So, how do cells become cancerous? You don't transmit cancer. You don't contract it. So how do cells become cancerous? Well, they become transformed. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the genetics of transformation in the lecture. But the transformation process is the way a normal cell becomes a cancerous cell. And essentially what they do is they become immortal. They become immortalized. And that's a term in cell culture that means that they don't stop their ability to divide and replicate. So most cells in the body we can actually take outside of the body ex vivo. We can put them in cell culture like an in vitro culture, and we can grow them outside the body. They do quite well. But they only go through a set number of generations or divisions, or what we call passages. And after a while, they start wearing out. And they don't behave like they originally did. Cancer cells don't do that. They are spontaneously immortalized. They never stop their ability to replicate, even ex vivo, outside of the body. So there's another great book that, I talked about a movie, now I'm talking about a book. They haven't made a movie of it yet that I'm aware of. Has anybody heard of HeLa cells? Anybody know why they're called HeLa cells?
They're from Henrietta Lacks.
They're from Henrietta Lacks, is a woman. Anything else that you know about the story?
Yeah, she had cancer.
Cervical.
Yeah,
Cervical cancer.
And at the time, there's like a lot of not known that could never get cells to grow and maintain in the lab. And so hers were the first cells they were taken, and she didn't even know they were taken and grown in the cell culture, and they actually grew were able to maintain for a long time.
Yeah, so Henrietta Lacks was a patient. Okay? She was an African American woman that had cervical cancer, and her physician grew her cells in the laboratory without her permission, didn't tell her about it. This was years back. And was impressed that they were able to grow without stopping, and we weren't able to do that yet. And so to keep the patient's name anonymous, they referred to them as HeLa cells. Well, HeLa cells have been well researched for decades now. And she passed away, but she never consented to her tissue being used this way. And that's one of the reasons for all these forms that you have to fill out every time you go to the doctor, is you have these stories like Henrietta Lacks. But the HeLa cell line was a cervical cancer line that grows immortally inside a petri dish. Okay? And not only does it grow without stopping, most cells are what we call contact inhibited or anchorage dependent. That means if you have a dish and you put a population of cells in the bottom of that dish and you let them grow, they're going to grow out like a lawn, like a grass lawn. And when they hit the border, they're going to stop. Okay? They actually slow down their growth when they hit the edge of the plate. They realize they're running out of real estate, so they're going to start slowing their division. This is called anchorage dependency, okay, and contact inhibition, meaning that they're only going to grow where they're right next to each other, but they're not going to start growing on top of each other. Cancer cells will start growing on top of each other. Okay, so they're anchorage independent, and they are not contact inhibited. And the HeLa cells were the first ones that we saw in culture that behave that way. That is not normal. Okay, if you think about it, it makes sense. Translate that into the body, into a tissue. If you had a wound on your skin and your fibroblasts grew in, you want them to stop when they reach the border. You know what I mean? You don't want them to keep growing and all of a sudden you got like another arm. Like every time you got it cut, some new limb grew out of it, right? It would look really weird. So that would be kind of the analogy, is if your normal cells were not contact inhibited, they weren't anchorage dependent, and they grew like cancer cells, every time you had a wound, you would actually grow something else there. It wouldn't just grow like a covering and it would stop. So in the wound healing lecture, we never really thought about like, wow, that's great that it regenerates tissue and sometimes all the function comes back. How does it know when to turn off? That's built into the DNA, where you have anchorage dependency and you have contact inhibition. That's programmed, so you know where the borders are, right? How many been in one of those cars that has like the lane departure thing? That kind of fun? Like, you know, you can climb back and watch the movie with the kids and just put it on cruise. No, I'm just kidding. But every time the car kind of moves over, right, it kind of shakes the steering wheel and tells you to turn back. It knows where those lanes are. That's how our cells are. They're programmed to understand where those boundaries are and where it should stop growing. Question?
Is that what's going on with keloid cells? Do they not have that contact inhibition?
So the keloids is actually not the cells. It's the product of the cells, which is the collagen that they produce. So they just produce overly abundant collagen, but the cells stop their division. They just make too much collagen along the way. Okay, but that's a good question. So autonomy. Cells that become cancerous act on their own. They don't listen to other cues of stopping division. They're anchorage independent. They grow on their own. They don't worry about whether or not they're growing on top of another cell. They're immortal. They don't stop dividing. Okay? They don't have a definitive point at which they can no longer divide. And we'll talk about what that is, and that has a lot to do with telomeres, telomere length. And then there's anaplasia. Anaplasia is a term that means a loss of organization. So this is like what we saw on the benign versus malignant slide, where we had a loss of organization, or it's poorly differentiated. It's not organized like uterine smooth muscle. It's unorganized. That's anaplasia. The other piece of anaplasia is there's an increase in the size of the nucleus. These two aspects or characteristics define anaplasia. And then you also see what's called pleomorphism with cancer cells. Pleomorphism is a variable shape and size. Okay, very similar to this poikilocytosis. Okay, unequal shape. This one's variable shape and size. So, immortalization. How do these cells become immortalized? Well, if you think about stem cells, when we started the semester, we defined these stem cells, right? These are cells that have an ability to become another cell type, right? Given the right cues, they can turn into something else. So your bone marrow stem cells can become B cells, right? They go to the thymus and be terminally differentiated into T cells, right? They're hematopoietic of origin. They can become circulating blood cells, white blood cells and red blood cells. So your stem cells are very important. And if you look at stem cells and the number of cell divisions, you can kind of appreciate that they're fairly high in their ability to divide. Right? So the stem cells follow this curve, and the longer the telomere, or the longer the telomere is preserved, the greater the ability for the cell to divide. So telomeres are a piece of DNA that's found on the end of the 3 and the 5 primes. And these telomeres are like little bumpers, and they preserve the integrity of the DNA that's going to be copied. And DNA replication is a very aggressive process. If you remember back to basic bio. I mean, you literally rip it apart, okay, and then you find the copy that matches, and then you make another copy. Okay, so unzipping it and ripping it apart can be a very dangerous or damaging process. You can do a lot of trauma, and you remember that there were processes in place to make sure that the copy was done correctly. Well, telomeres are part of that. And every time replication happens, those telomeres actually get a little shorter. Well, we have an enzyme in the body known as telomerase that helps to lengthen the telomere. But as we age, our telomeres become a little shorter as we get older, okay? Inevitably. And so most of the research on aging points to the role of the telomere. If we didn't lose telomere length, likely our cells would not age like they do. And that's really considered to be the fountain of youth research, is how do you preserve telomere length? So stem cells that are longer in telomeres have a longer ability to divide. Normal cells have shorter telomeres. And then the germline, right, at the level of the gametes, telomere length is appropriately preserved because that's where life begins, at the level of the germline. Now, cancer cells, and I'll get to your question, cancer cells at some point mutate and they start lengthening their telomeres. And as they lengthen their telomeres, this is a method by which they become immortal. They never lose their ability to continue to divide. Yes?
So when you say telomere length, doesn't that mean like DNA length?
It's not the DNA that's actually coding for what you're going to replicate. It's a piece of DNA that's non-coded that protects the integrity of the coded portion of the DNA. So they're like little bumpers on the end of the 3 and the 5 prime. Okay? Yes?
You said telomerase is the enzyme that helps keep the length, right?
Correct.
So in like these cancerous tissues, do you expect to see like higher amounts of
You would expect to see higher levels of telomerase activity in many different tumors. Yep, that's exactly right. Okay, there was a coffee table publication that came out in February of 2011. And this was the front page. It has nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about. But not a science magazine. It's a coffee table magazine. But there was some real interesting science inside. This guy's not from Flagstaff. Okay, not my neighbor. But in this particular article, and I'll read it for you, what's in the red box. But this was giving credit to some work that was done in 1985. This is a 2011 publication, so it's still 7 years old. They were talking about work that happened in the laboratory in 1985. A Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn, who was at Berkeley at the time, and her graduate student, Carol Greeter, discovered this telomerase enzyme. So this is 1985. That's probably before your time, but still within recent history. And So Blackburn and Greeter found the enzyme telomerase. They named it, and when it was active in cells, it lengthened those telomeres as the cells repeatedly divided, and helping them to replenish their numbers. They received for that work in 2009 the Nobel Peace Prize in Physiology and Medicine with another telomere researcher known as Jack Szatek of Harvard Medical School. And this journal article is referencing a publication that they did together in Nature, which is not a coffee table magazine. Nature is absolutely a top-tier peer-reviewed journal. And what they discovered and they published in Nature in 2011 was that every time a cell divides, its telomeres get shorter. Once a cell runs out of telomeres, it can't reproduce anymore and dies. But there's this enzyme called telomerase that reverses this process. It's one of the reasons cancer cells live so long. So why not treat regular non-cancerous cells with telomerase? And in November of 11, researchers at Harvard Medical School announced in Nature they had done just that. They administered telomerase to a group of mice suffering from age-related degeneration. The damage went away, and the mice didn't get better, didn't just get better, they actually got younger. So we have a recorded event in Nature, the journal Nature, in 2011 of these Nobel Peace Prize winners converting telomerase into non-cancerous cells to actually extend the longevity of those cells. Okay? Pretty amazing. Okay? All right, I have a question for you guys before we move on. Pretend you're the physician. You've just talked with your patient. They have a lipoma. They express some concern because their sister was recently diagnosed with the liposarcoma, and it sounds like he has the same thing. So what do you tell your patient to calm them down?
They caught it early.
Caught it early? What does that mean? Use some other terminology. I agree.
It's benign.
It's benign. Okay. Really, typically the suffix of oma usually means benign. And sarcoma typically is the dangerous kind, which is malignant. And that's absolutely right, is they caught it early. Okay? All right. Last slide, and then we're going to take a break. Anaplasia. Back to up here. Loss of organization and an increase in nuclear size. Often you find anaplasia and pleomorphism together with cancerous masses, but I want you to understand independently what they refer to. Does that make sense? So for example, on the exam, you would be expected to understand the difference between anaplasia and pleomorphism. Or a pleomorphic cell is a cell that has a variable shape and size. And when you have anaplasia in a tissue, you're specifically talking about a larger nuclear size and a loss of organization. So look at this slide. You usually don't see them independently, but I want you to know independently what they refer to. Does that make sense? Okay, so don't get caught on the exam, not understanding what I'm asking. Up top, far right, that's histology of what tissue? What does that look like to you? Up top, upper right, what does that tissue look like? It's normal tissue. Looks like adipose. What else does it look like? Looks like muscle. What kind of muscle? Skeletal muscle, right? That's exactly what it is, a skeletal muscle. I can see why you would think it was adipose tissue. The difference with adipose tissue is those large open circles would typically be vacuoles, and they would be unstained. They would be kind of white. They'd be a little bit more round. So this is actually a muscle cell that you're looking in cross section. Okay, skeletal muscle upper right. This was skeletal muscle lower right. That's an anaplastic tumor of skeletal muscle known as a rhabdomyosarcoma. RHABDOMYO sarcoma. SARCOMA. So point out to me on this rhabdomyosarcoma on the lower right, which used to be skeletal muscle. Picture normal skeletal muscle is the upper right. Point out to me what you see using these terms. Yes?
Enlarged nucleus size.
Enlarged nucleus, right? Look at this guy. That's huge. Look at the normal, this is the same magnification. Look at the normal size of the nucleus on the edges here. Right? That's a very large nucleus. Is there a loss of organization?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay? Everywhere that you look. So you see anaplasia, no question. What about pleomorphism? Do you see that? Somebody explain.
There is no similar shape, there is no consistent shape.
There's no, these are
Size.
all mostly the same size. You guys can appreciate that? Here's a huge multinucleated some kind of cell. I don't know what you call that. Here's the opposite, large cell with only one nucleus, right? And then you've got, there's nothing in here that even resembles a skeletal muscle cell, right? Nothing in there that even resembles it. So here you've got both pleomorphism and anaplasia seen together in this rhabdomyosarcoma. Okay, let's take a break. We'll come back.